Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week, there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. Today's guest, Tiffany Yu, is an American entrepreneur and disability rights advocate who founded Diversability, which is a social enterprise to advocate for equality for people with disabilities. She is also the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, which is coming out in October this year. And I let her talk a little bit more about it in a moment. Thank you so much for coming on the channel, Tiffany.
Thanks for having me on.
So, first of all, can you explain in your words, tell us a little bit about your book and what your goal was in writing it?
Yeah, so the book is called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a Disability-Inclusive World. And essentially, I know you said in my intro that I'm the founder of Diversability. Diversability is actually turning 15 this year. And so over the last 15 years, I've just had
So you started in kindergarten?
You can listen to the other podcast for the skincare recommendations. But yeah, so we're turning 15 this year. And over the years, I've just been asked so many questions about how we can better show up for the disability community. And my hope with this book is that actually one of my favorite reviews said, this book left me feeling energized that building a disability inclusive society is possible. And so what I hope this book does is that it educates you on the enormity of this system of oppression that is ableism and makes you feel hopeful that there are actionable things that you can do to really address it and make change, not only within yourself and your local communities, but hopefully in our broader society as well.
I really enjoyed the book. I felt that it was very accessible, actually. And, the truth is that people who are marginalized are forced to spend a lot more time thinking about their marginalization than people who are more privileged. So it can be sometimes, especially in a kind of modern day where everyone feels like everyone's out to catch someone out. And it can be like a fraught experience to even begin having those conversations, because the things that are obvious to someone with your experience, will be new to someone with my experience, and, and vice versa. And, how do you encourage people to even begin the conversation?
I include this in the book, or I include actually a lot. You read the book, so I include a lot of this,
But our readers have not yet, so
yes, your listeners have not yet. But one thing I say, well, the first thing I'll acknowledge is that, and I mentioned this in the book, is that privilege is like air. Privilege is also having the ability to opt out. So I love the way that you said those of us who do have different minoritized identities spend a lot of time thinking about them because we can't opt out, right? Not only do we experience violence in our own everyday lives, we also experience what I call secondary violence of other people who look like us, whatever different identities those are, who are experiencing violence in their own communities. But I think to answer your question of how do you even start to address this, or how do you even decide that this is something you want to learn more about, I talk a lot about how allyship comes from intimacy. And I mean intimacy in a broader sense of just really getting to know somebody. And I actually I'd love to share just a random example from my life more recently, but I went to a wedding a couple months ago in Turkey with one of my friends from college who was getting married. I have known this person, the groom, for 18 years. And while I was there, some of his wife's friends asked me, "Hey, Tiffany, I noticed that a lot of your college friends seem to be a little bit more conservative. Like, given the work that you do in the disability space, like how are these your friends?" That was essentially kind of the question. And what I told him was that I've known my college friends for half of my life. And they care about the things I care about because I care about them and they care about me. And whether or not, and to me, this advocating for the disability community is not a partisan issue, but no matter who you are, in all of these different experiences I had in my life, and I also started my career in a place like Goldman Sachs, like on Wall Street. So I want to openly acknowledge that I have all different sorts of friends who have very different beliefs, but because we've known each other and created this intimacy of our friendship and it's authentic, they will show up for me, or I hope they show up for me in the times, and they care about me in the times that it really matters.
Absolutely. And I think, when it comes to, when we talk about diversity of like people that we get exposed to as well, I think it's so important, and something that people forget about in the time of polarization that is as extreme as now, especially in the States.
Yeah, and there's a part
you
in the
need
book.
to have people from different backgrounds and different beliefs.
Exactly. And there's a chapter in the book called Diversify Your Feed. Oops. And a big, sorry, I dropped the book. And a big part of it is who is in our echo chamber. Like, it's not a bad thing, because the thing is, we are naturally attracted to people who have similar experiences than us. But if we truly want to help shape our worldview, I mean, this is part of why I think so many people, well, maybe I'll just speak for me, why I love traveling, because I get exposed to different parts of the world that have totally different governments than I am used to, architecture that's very different, weather that's very different, and people who are very different too. So yeah, I think, and I will also acknowledge that I wonder if it takes a certain type of person who intentionally wants to put themselves into what I call growth edge situations where you might feel uncomfortable at first because it's a little bit unfamiliar, but the more you have familiarity with that community or with that environment, it's not such an uncomfortable thing anymore. And I even look back at my own experience. So I've been disabled for 27 years. As I mentioned, I've been entrenched in the disability space for 15. So half of those, I wasn't really in disability communities. And I still think back to my first time of like making my first disabled friends. And now I spend all day long, with my disabled friends, but that's not usual for other people, right? But because I was wanting to get more involved in the disability community, I started to be more intentional about different communities and different people that I wanted to meet. And now for me, it's a very common thing that I'm around my disabled friends all day long. And for other people, maybe you might only have one disabled friend that you know of so far, because the majority of disabilities you can't see. But also, if you do want to better show up for the disability community, in what ways are you intentionally seeking out being in more disability-centered communities as well?
I think also, like you mentioned in the book, we're all pre-disabled. So it's like, the older we get, the more disabled friends we tend to have. But
And I think back to like why I started Diversability those 15 years ago, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and I looked around and I saw a lot of parents of disabled kids, and then I saw a lot of older adults who had later in life onset disabilities, but no one, and I'm a millennial. Now everyone is focused on Gen Z, but people cared about millennials 15 years ago. But at the time in my early 20s, there was nothing really kind of acknowledging, hey, if you're a disabled millennial or a disabled person in your 20s to 30s, and you don't fit in this kids category and you don't fit in this older adults category, where do you go to hang out and find community and support and resources as well?
yes, I think it's that's something that's been like a huge shift over the last 20 years, actually. And so I come from Poland, and from the capital city, not the sticks, and yet the capital city was so inaccessible. I mean, it's marginally better now, but when I was growing up, the disabled people were basically invisible, in terms of you did not see people in wheelchair on the road, because nothing was accessible to them. A lot of people would be essentially trapped in their flats with no lift. My high school which was, one of the best high schools in Warsaw. But if you had mobility issues, you were kind of left on your own. It was like a joke, basically. It was like some kind of cartoon, satire. There was like a ramp going to the hall, and then 4 wheelchairs, right? And then 4 sets of staircases. And that was so typical of Warsaw growing up. And the first person that with mobility issues, but the first person who was a wheelchair user who I had a conversation with was a girl who I was volunteering at the kind of, the local Paralympics in Warsaw. And I was assigned to help this girl who was a wheelchair user. And I was not sure what I was supposed to do. I was like, okay, do I push you around? And she was like, do not touch my wheelchair, right? Like, I don't need to. And she was in general, like, very, very angry. But it was my first experience. And I was like, well, I can actually see, like, I can see why you're angry. Because I'm told to chaperone you, like you're a toddler and you're here to compete, So it was, so that was a very interesting experience. But obviously, what I want to ask you about is how, you find accessibility and inclusion works together with what we call representation, as in people being visible in media and that.
Yeah, and I think they're intertwined, and I think the story you share highlights it, where, you talked about growing up, if you have mobility related disabilities, it was very difficult to get around. One of the biggest microaggressions that disabled people face is what I had called chronic exclusion growing up, but the way it manifests is people don't even think about us. So we're not even seen because we can't even navigate the infrastructure. Right? What that also ties to is what I call like an assumption funnel. And there's a video that went viral recently of this actress with Down syndrome, Madison Tevlin. And it starts out with her saying, because you assume I don't drink, you don't serve me a drink, so I don't drink. And I think this translates back to your experience where because someone assumed that a wheelchair user wouldn't want to go to that business, they don't make it accessible, so the wheelchair user can't access that business, right? It's kind of like this root of assumptions that are happening. But I think to your point around, we just experienced the Paris Paralympics. I had the honor of getting to actually attend the opening ceremony and go. Yeah, it was so fun. And it was electric. It was electric to be there. But it kind of reminded me of 2 things, which is in order, and Emily Ladau, another disability advocate, said this. She said, in order to make the world more accessible, we need to make the disability experience more accessible to the world. I'll say that again because I flubbed it up. So in order to make the world more accessible, we need to make the disability experience more accessible to the world. One way that manifests is by what you said, increasing visibility of our community. So not only is it visibility of those of us who have apparent disability, it's also creating more visibility around those of us who also have non-apparent disabilities like mental health disabilities or chronic illnesses. And it's not just the visibility and the representation. I think respect also needs to be paired with it. So I will say we have examples of disability representation, but they are inaccurate in the sense that they are all narratives that are rooted in pity or tragedy or charity, right? Yeah. In that case, you're still creating visibility, you still have representation, but is it creating respect? Is it done in a dignified way? It also makes me think about the example you shared of supporting this Paralympic athlete who you were unfamiliar with the scenario, and she will know best how best you can support her, but how do you create more open dialogues? And especially also understanding that if you have an apparent disability, the number of times people offer to help you is probably more than you would like, right? But it's help done through a pity lens and not necessarily through a respect lens. So one thing I do hear a lot is within the disability community, people will say, I'll help. I mean, people won't say this, but the way discrimination manifests is it says, I'll help you, but I won't hire you.
Yeah, but that is the sympathy rather than empathy, I think, approach. And sort of tying into to what you're saying, and tying in with the theme of the show, which is storytelling, is the reason it matters so much is like there's this phenomenon in psychology called the Caliban effect. And you kind of touch on it. You don't mention it specifically, but you mention it in your book about how when you call someone, you know, weak, helpless, they tend to become that. And when you say you're so capable, you're strong, you got this, they automatically start behaving more like following those patterns. And that, which is why also like representation is so important. This ad you mentioned, it's a fantastic ad for those who haven't seen it, which was running, and it was basically all about how the like effects of how people perceive this girl limit her existence. You know, when you mentioned that like disabled people are the original life hackers, I think that is a wonderful way of presenting it, because that gives us an in to sort of, you know, push forward the, you know, the sort of more informative approach, you know, when it comes to, you know, people hiring or educational opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually, Liz Jackson wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple years ago called "We Are the Original Life Hackers." And it's really made me think about all of, and this was in regard, it was part of the disability opinion column. And it talked about all the different ways that we as disabled people have life hacked because we exist in a world that wasn't built for us. And there's one person mentioned in the op-ed named Jaron Herman. He's my friend. He has cerebral palsy that also impacts his use of one arm. And he mentions in the piece, or Liz mentions in the piece, that he uses a pizza cutter to cut waffles. And when I read that, I was like, that is so smart. I'm going to start using a pizza cutter to like cut anything.
Yeah.
But that's just an example, you know, it kind of ties into this to this other concept called the curb cut effect, which essentially in the 70s, there was a group of students who were wheelchair users, and as an act of defiance, they cut sloping ramps into the curb so that they could get their wheelchairs onto the sidewalk. And as a result of that, not only was that helpful for parents with strollers or people with package delivery carts, or even me with my roller carry-on luggage, it just so happened that that benefited the disability community. Cutting these curbs ended up benefiting a lot of other people as well. So it kind of goes two ways, where it's, okay, we are currently existing in a world that wasn't built for us. And so we've had to learn how to be adaptive, flexible, creative, innovative, figure out ways to do things. And then at the same time, some of these things that have been designed to help support the disability community, like audiobooks and electric toothbrushes, are things that now are more commercially available to a lot of other people. And one of the things that I've actually been thinking about, and one of my disabled friends posted about this, was there are so many access features that we use on our smartphones. So one could be using speech to text when you're drafting up a text message, or even if you turn your phone on silent and it vibrates when the phone rings or you get a text message, or even some people have turned on, like, if the phone rings, your flashlight will blink. Those are all accessibility features. And one of my friends posted something and she said, if you are using all these access tools on your smartphone, please know that they were originally designed to help disabled people like use their smartphone. And I hope that this will also encourage you to prioritize disability inclusion. Like, think about us. Don't just use our tools and our features, also help support and uplift us as a community.
Yeah, I think when it comes to representation, it's especially important that people who have particular disabilities are, key, like, they take a key part in all of those developments, because simply people without those disabilities will not know exactly the small annoyances, because that's the problem, isn't it? It's like, people want to help in general. Most people, I hope, I think, yeah. So let's assume. And so, but they will not have that insight. And that's, what comes in, where, making friends with disabilities comes into play. But, like you did for the first, 10 years, I think you said, of being disabled, like, you did not have disabled friends. People might not know how to even approach that. And I think, but that, joins in with, why isn't your workplace inclusive enough for you to have disabled colleagues?
Mm, mm. I mean, a couple things come up, which is more of us are disabled than people who are living with anxiety and depression or ADHD, dyslexia. I'm now seeing a lot of interest in wanting to better support neurodivergent employees. And I'm also seeing a lot of friends I've known for a long time start to share more openly them living with their chronic illnesses or their mental health disabilities or their neurodivergent disabilities. So there are more of us out there than you think. And I think, to your point around ensuring that disabled people are kind of embedded into every part of not only the design process but our workplace, I think this is where the assumptions come in again, right? So I include an example in the book of something that are called accessibility web overlays. And these are AI plugins, a couple lines of code that you can put onto your website that create this accessibility menu. But unfortunately, what it has done is it has broken accessibility and made it harder for those who use screen readers to even access the website in the first place. Because now, if they're on a screen reader, the menu comes up even before the website shows up and they're not sure how to navigate. And that's an example. Some of those companies are publicly traded with revenues in the millions or have raised millions of dollars in VC funding. And I would love to see that VC funding get reallocated to support disabled entrepreneurs who are building things and have the intimacy with the problems they're trying to solve. But I get off my soapbox, but I share that to say someone just assumed, oh, it must be hard for this person who's using a screen reader to create this website. And a lot of small businesses aren't sure where to start in terms of how to make their websites more accessible. So let me try to solve this problem. And instead, it's made it more difficult. And I believe last year there were 900 lawsuits against businesses that did use those overlays. And I hate to bring like lawsuits and litigation into it, but a lot of times, unfortunately, here in the US, that is how the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is enforced. But it's also just like and this comes back to like our visibility conversation. 70 to 80% of disabilities are not apparent, right? So in addition to me having a paralyzed arm, I also live with PTSD. I do feel like in my day-to-day living with PTSD and, I am aware of what my triggers are, but you never know when they're going to happen. I feel like that impacts me more. And that's when my PTSD becomes apparent, right? Is when I get triggered and need to find ways to manage and de-escalate those situations. We kind of need more visibility there. And that's why I feel excited about more chronic illness advocates, more mental health advocates, more long haul COVID advocates speaking up, because coming back to the assumptions, people can look at my hand and say, oh, that looks different. I can understand that you have a disability there. People can't look at this, or people have a hard time just looking at me navigating the world and know that I'm living with a mental health disability. And so I think that the more that we bring visibility and make it not make it more common, but I will say that many of us coming out of the pandemic, it was traumatic for a lot of us. And whether or not we, hopefully, my hope is that all of us are able to find the mental health support that we need. But when we create so much stigma around mental health and healing from trauma, or don't acknowledge it as something that needs support, or we pathologize it and use it as an insult and tell people like, oh, you're mentally ill, it actually makes it less likely and disincentivizes more of us from seeking help, right? When we've made it a joke, or we said like, oh, like that's not real, right? It is real. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean there's not stuff going on.
But that links to something you've been talking about at the very beginning of your book, which is the sort of the concept of the disability origin story. And in general, I am very uneasy about creating a world where people feel obliged to disclose extremely deeply personal information. You know, I went to a Worldcon in Glasgow, and it had in it forms on marginalization, and they were not anonymized in any way. I've spoken to a few people who are like, you know, there's a question, have you been marginalized? And they just ticked yes, because they felt like, well, I'm just not going to get on any panels if I don't tick it. I just refused to sort of fill in any of this information. I just found it very deeply invasive. And I thought, you know, on the one hand, we want people to feel comfortable, you know, but on the other hand, it's so dangerous when you're forcing people to out themselves, especially as, you know, we don't live in a fully inclusive world, unfortunately. And how do you balance that? This, because I feel like there's so much pressure now. You see people's bios on their, you know, social media, and they have their things like their sexuality and their, you know, neurodivergence diagnosis and all that. And I'm just thinking, like, I'm a private person, even though I have a show. I'm actually a very private person in many ways, and I find it so objectifying. And because most people, I feel like, feel under pressure to say this about themselves, so they won't be attacked if they talk about something they have intimate sort of knowledge of. How do you sort of resolve that conflict?
Yeah, it's a very personal decision. So I know I'm very public with my disabilities, and I have friends who have non-apparent disabilities who come and tell me that they don't want to be viewed a certain way, and that's why they haven't disclosed or shared. I think I'll come back. So one thing, I'll say two things. The first is, when I started Diversability, I made it intentionally open to disabled and non-disabled people to join, because I also knew there were a lot of disabled people who weren't ready to identify as disabled and may never be, but who still wanted community, right? And what's interesting about your share is something I'm super proud of is with Diversability is what I call these longtime lurkers, these people who are in our community for years, just observing and witnessing and occasionally chiming in on conversations, to all of a sudden sharing their disability origin story because they were now part of a supportive community where they felt safe enough to say, oh, hey, like, here's something that I am living with. And because of all of you, like, I'm ready to share my story. I think it comes back, you know, and your podcast is about storytelling. And part of why I'm so open is that for 10 plus years after the accident, I didn't tell anyone the story. But at the same time, and I don't know if this is an American thing, but I have had conversations with my friends who grew up in Europe who when we're collecting like optional demographic information of our audience at our different events and things, they'll be like, why are you asking for this? Because And then they would tell me like, where I'm from, like, we're actually not allowed because people can use this information to weaponize other communities or further marginalize other communities. And I don't know, in some ways, and again, this is me with my like US gaze. I was born in the US and I was also raised here. I'm also the daughter of Asian immigrants. I didn't share as much of this in the book, but I didn't actually identify as Asian until I was 18. And if people called me Asian, I would retort back that I was American. Not that they're mutually exclusive, but it felt like in some ways that was like a racist microaggression of them trying to make me not from here, which is something that happens in the US. So,
I mean, Americans have a very particular and very unique view on race and nationality and all that, because, you know, even Asian, like, you know, you're obviously, your parents are from somewhere, not from the continent of Asia. They're not from Russia, right? Like, so this idea of describing people in a particular way rather than letting them tell you, you know, their background is also very interesting.
Well, one thing I am learning from the Asian diaspora is part of where that term came from was part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s of you have people from all of these different countries that actually don't share language or history or much anything, but in order to build power and influence, they came under this umbrella. And I think about this with disability too. It's so diverse. Me not being able to use one arm or living with a mental health disability is different from someone who's a wheelchair user or has a vision or hearing related disability. But how do we build power? How do we build influence under this umbrella term? So I don't know if there's a way to wrap this part of our conversation up in a bow.
That was a bit of an aside.
But I will say I feel really liberated identifying in the ways that I do, because I even think back to this example of the pizza cutter. So something for me growing up that was very anxiety inducing was anytime I would go out for dinner and order an entree of some kind of meat that I couldn't easily cut. What would essentially happen when I would just not eat the dish. I would just eat around it. And I would spend more time thinking about how to eat my food than I would engaging with the other people that I was with. That now that it's very open, not only on the internet, but in my life, that one of my arms is paralyzed. If I go, now I say, hey, by the way, is it okay if the kitchen is able to cut this steak dish before it comes out? And usually, actually, all the time, not an issue at all. And it makes me think back to kind of all those instances in the beginning where, yes, that's personal information, but how did it also detract from the experience or negatively impact the experiences I was having because I wasn't asking for the assistance that I needed to eat the dish? And I know that's kind of like a funny everyday one, but it really caused me a lot of anxiety.
It doesn't sound funny at all, actually. It sounds like, you know, deeply difficult sort of sets of decisions that you have to go through. And I think it's, you know, I wouldn't want to sort of gloss over that or be flippant about it, because it's a process, isn't it? And taking the shame away and taking all those negative connotations that other people put on you, that is not an easy process, is it?
Yeah. And I will say that I shared some version of that on social media, and I got two types of responses. The first type of response was, oh, you should have just asked someone for help. And again, those million of decisions, but those millions of decisions that we as disabled people have to navigate every single day. And then the second were other disabled people who said, oh, anytime there's a conference meal, anytime there's a meal during the conference or a buffet or something, I just go back up to my room and I eat an energy bar. they understood, right? We have to navigate all of these things
Yeah.
all the time. And yeah, I guess coming back to your question around like, how do you choose what stories, like, how do you decide what you're gonna share? I guess I come back to, and every chapter in the book, has these reflection questions at the end. This isn't one of them. And I originally had much more that I wanted to share about disability origin stories, but I felt like this may not necessarily have been the audience in this book. But one of my friends is writing a book called Boldly Belong that I could see that is more geared toward the disability community and finding our voice. But anyway, back to the reflection questions. I think back to stories. And I think back to, why am I sharing this story? Is there some lesson in there? Or am I providing some context that helps someone understand something? Maybe I want some assistance cutting my steak, you know? So again, it's, am I just, why am I sharing? I guess like storytelling with purpose.
Yes, exactly. And it, storytelling that comes from you, I think, rather than being taken from you. Like, so you also at this point have created a structure of support that mean that this story will not necessarily be taken from you and framed in a way that is detrimental to your well-being. And I think that is, when it comes to kind of more, I don't want to say like it's not necessarily positive, it's just more accurate, I would say, representation of people's capabilities. I'm just going to share something. My great grandmother was disabled, so she was when she was a kid, she was hit by a ricocheted bullet and her right arm basically atrophied completely. And in rural Poland of pre-war period, that was very significant. And yet she was incredibly capable, and she didn't seem to let it stop it from doing any things. Like she was running away from a Red Army, then running away from the Gestapo. She kept 3 very young sons alive. She was writing letters for people. That's how she was getting some money for food and all that throughout the war. And I grew up with that story, and I always thought of her. I didn't think of her as a disabled person necessarily. I just thought about like of her, how incredibly capable she was, because frankly, I'm not sure I could do what she did. And yet in all the photos I see of her, she kind of hides that arm. And that is something I've always noticed, how even though, she had a loving family, she had like a huge community of people that genuinely admired her. And yet she must have had some sort of residual sense of shame that, someone put on her in her childhood. And it's, how do we kind of dismantle those structures across cultures is something that I was wondering, because obviously you live in California, right? Do I have it correct? Yeah. So California leans in a very particular way, culturally. I imagine if you went to the Midwest or Texas or whatever, like you would meet with very different sets of attitudes. And how do you navigate translating this experience in a way that doesn't feel, it's not stigmatizing necessarily, it's more that if you can't take something and go on an attack in a culture that has a visceral reaction to it, and you have to sort of be clever about how you message things. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind, which is, if I think about the hiding of the arm in photos, I can very much relate to that. And Brene Brown has, she's got a ton of books. she's a shame researcher. And one of the things I learned from her is that shame festers in secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I was similar to, was it your great-grandmother?
Yeah.
I was similar. And I can go back and I see photos of myself where my arm is hidden. And during the pandemic, as I was reading and watching more of Brene Brown's work, I started to get really fascinated by how can I unlearn my own internalized shame. And one of the things she says is that for women, our biggest area of shame is around our body. So disability or not, there's still a lot of unlearning, even around this intersection of sexism and ableism. But I digress a little bit. So secrecy, silence, and judgment, shame festers. So I started to become really fascinated by, I have shame around the way my hand looks. What are the actionable things that I can do to start to unlearn that shame? And that actually came from starting to make video content. Because in video, I mean, now with AI wasn't as popularized a couple years ago. Like the hand was whatever the hand looked like. You couldn't put a filter on it or something like that. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. But I think to your question around how do we call people into this work without them feeling attacked? Again, I think
Across
it comes
different cultures, I think, as well.
across different cultures. I think, and again, and I acknowledge this in the book as well, like born and raised in the US, dad from Taiwan, mom from Vietnam, but haven't really spent significant time in either of those areas. I think it happens not only from like an intimacy level, but I also know my messages are going to resonate with people who find some similarity with me and my story. And I got invited to do a speaking engagement in Qatar in the Middle East. And I also had to acknowledge, like, I'm not from there. And the invitation was to hear from someone who was born and raised in the US and some of the things I'm learning about the disability community. But my hope is, and I actually think that the social media and the pandemic have democratized access to information in a way, is maybe you'll see someone who's talking about disability in a way that makes you more curious. You start to follow that person, you get to know them, you start to see maybe they feature other people in their content. I don't know, I'm playing out this whole scenario. But I think again, this is part of why I have enjoyed traveling and also being part of global communities, is that my hope, and one thing I share a lot about, is that learning should never be about shame. And so I'm here to learn from other cultures as well. And I'm also learning every single day from other members in the disability community who have different disabilities than I do. And hopefully all of those different perspectives together will help continue to shape my views around disability. And part of why I am excited that Diversability is turning 15 this year is that I have seen change. I've stayed in this long enough that 15 years ago, there was almost no appetite for this type of conversation. And actually the most overt, actually two things people said to me in 2009 is, how do you think you're going to get people to care? That was a real question. And then the other was, I don't understand how anyone could be proud of their disability.
Oh.
And I don't really get questions like that as much anymore 15 years later. And that's how I kind of like anchor seeing the change. But also I'm super excited that, I mean, I will acknowledge, like, I go and look at my stats, 70% of my audience is the US. So I know, okay, I'm talking to a US audience. I have friends, actually, this book will be launching in the UK in March 2025. And I have a couple friends in the UK, but there are really large, amazing disability advocates in the UK, probably in Poland too. I couldn't name any. I would probably have to do some research, but I think everywhere we're starting to see, what's that saying? Like the rising tide lifts all boats. I'm
Yeah.
starting to see just kind of elevation, even just teeny bits of progress
I mean,
everywhere.
they're not teeny. Like, you know, from my childhood in Poland, and like I said, you know, it would people with disabilities were just invisible. Nobody talked about them. Nobody included them in anything. To this awareness that is, you know, obviously mostly located around like big cities, but people now know about so many more disabilities. You know, there's no talk of autism. Nobody knew what autism was, you know, when I was growing up. So all of those things, but that is enormous change, and it's, you know, it's something for you to be very proud of that you're part of it. You know, the question you mentioned, the first one, not the literally offensive second one that someone asked you, professor asked you. I've been thinking about this question a lot actually since I read it. About that, they ask you how you get people to care about disabled people, and I was actually thinking a lot about it yesterday, because I was thinking like the most sort of generous interpretation of this question is how do you bridge the empathy gap? So taken in that very generous light, it's, you know, less offensive because there is a huge empathy gap. And the reason that it really stuck with me is because my oldest daughter had a close friend in the first 2 years of education in primary school. This girl is deaf. In the second year, she got the, you know, the implant, but, you know, she was just at the beginning of the journey to even be able to, you know, there was no ability to lip read or anything like that. And they were the class teacher as assistant could use a sign language, a British Sign Language. And my daughter, because she really liked this girl and she really cared about this girl, raised the question of, can we have a club? Can we have a club where we learn the sign language? Because the girl was teaching her some like small signs, and at home, you know, I can't speak sign language, but we were watching some videos and, you know, to try and learn some simple ones. And the response from the school, so, you know, my child raised it, and then I went to the teachers and I was asking, can we do a club to support this girl? And the response was, we would love to. However, a lot of parents have had a viscerally negative reaction, even to the assistant translating using sign language in class, because they felt it distracts from their children's education. And that was absolutely heartbreaking. Like, it was just so heartbreaking. And, you know, in the context of this particular story, this question you were asked, how do we get people to care when the empathy gap is this deep? You know, and but I think in a way, like, you have answered it already. That's why I wasn't going to ask it until you think, like, the intimacy, isn't it?
I think it's intimacy. I mean, you brought it up earlier, all of us are pre-disabled. I mean, I have asked people in some of my presentations before, I say, you know, actually, I forget what the question was, but their answer was, I fear becoming disabled because the world isn't accessible, or I see how difficult things are for my disabled peers. At which point I kind of look at that and I say, this is why if we've really centered accessibility in everything, so that like you could show up at a space and not have to ask permission. I could order the steak and not think about all the other micro decisions of how to eat that. Then like when we all become disabled, it's all there. And I think this example that you shared around the interpreter being distracting,
I mean, she clearly wasn't. It's just like, even the way you're rephrasing it, like she clearly wasn't distracting. But there's
well, I guess I'm wondering, like, it.
I don't know.
I don't know. I had another thought.
I was just like, which ones? Which were like, I sometimes look at those patterns. I'm like, which ones were the ones complaining? I don't know. It's
Oh, sorry. What came up for me, and actually it's a little bit different, but I think a lot about like shine theory in my work. So again, with the rising tide lifts all boats. I don't know if that person who made that statement felt threatened in some way. Yeah, I don't know. But that's what came up for me, where it's like, hey, we all learn in different ways, and this is what this person needs to learn. Doesn't impact my own learning. So you do what you need to do, and I'll do what I need to do. And ultimately, my hope is that we all learn.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think there's also a question, because sort of leading from this is how we can, what you mentioned, I think, is a great approach. That, like, anytime you appeal to people's self-interest, the campaign is so much more likely to be successful, isn't it? But because it's, at the moment, we have a lot of very performative action from as you know, in your work, there's a lot of companies want to be seen as being very exclusive, very inclusive, and they don't actually pay attention. So it's just they want to have like the one token. I hear of it from my friends all the time. It's like the corporations being like, oh, like, let's get some Black person in this group because it's all like private school educated white guys, like, and rather than it being truly inclusive, right? So how do we sort of progress the sort of narratives to go past that performative action to create real structural change?
Yeah, I'm going to say something a little provocative, which
Go
is
on. Love it.
if the performative is where it starts, that's where accountability starts, right? So maybe the company put out the statement saying, hey, we champion disability inclusion at our company and disability employment. Then now you have a public thing you can go back to and say, hey, what's happening since then? So I don't know. I guess I also think too about how when I started my career, I may have been the only Asian disabled woman there. I don't know if I had consciousness around being tokenized then, but now I was in. And I look back at the opportunities that I've had to like go to private school, go to private university and work in the corporate world, which I know that a lot of other disabled people haven't. But what it has done, and my hope is that it has paved the way for other disabled people to say, hey, I want to go to Georgetown now too. And actually, I'm very proud of Georgetown because there has been so much outside of those initial comments that happened 15 years ago, there's been so much disability activity on the campus that just makes me really proud. But also those seeds were planted 15 years ago, laid dormant for a little while, maybe almost 10 years. And now in the last 5 years, there's been a lot happening. So things take time too. But all of that to say is that I think from a corporate perspective, when you give a disabled person a job, just knowing how bad our unemployment numbers are, we are contributing, not only contributing to those statistics, and I don't want to distill us down to just statistics, we are changing someone's life who may have been stuck in perpetual poverty based on some of the things that some of the laws that we have in place here that keep a lot of disabled people who have more, who rely on disability benefits and other stuff like that. So I think about my own experience and I say, I may have been a token, but I worked really hard while I was at that company to not only perform well, but also open up pathways for other disabled people to get opportunities at this place too. And something I am kind of excited about is one of our former team members, her name's Jessica. She was on Diversability's team. She never imagined, and she's a little younger. She was, I think, getting ready to start college when she was on our team. And she had never thought, and I don't know if this is a win, depending on how you look at it, but she had never thought that working in the corporate world or being in a business environment was something that she wanted to do or even thought she could do, right?
Mm.
And now she helped us with some of our partnerships, and she got to meet a lot of our corporate partners and have conversations with them and learn about their roles and network, not only within our community, on our team, but also with our partners. Now she's doing all these like cool internships at different tech startups and pursuing professional opportunities that she never thought possible. So in a lot of ways, I guess what I think about is this concept that Shonda Rhimes introduced, which is the FOD, the first only different. And sometimes these tokens are the FOD, and can we provide them enough support and mentorship and sponsorship so that they aren't the FOD and they open up pathways for everyone else who might look like them to then create that systems change that you're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your approach of using shame as a Trojan horse for structural change. I think
because sometimes, I mean,
yeah.
this is an area that I think there's still, not only is there so much discomfort, there's just a lot, the experience is inaccessible. We don't know that much. What we do see on the media isn't accurate or authentic. Now we're starting to see that change a little bit, that again, if the starting point is, hey, maybe this first time we're going to invite the speaker in, maybe, and my hope is that serves as a catalyst to be like, oh, okay, maybe next time we can start a disability employee resource group. And oh, maybe next time we can start to include more mental health well-being policies in our health plan of what we're offering, right? I think it starts to become this trickle.
And do you think that the government has a role to play in this? In just to give an example, I found out recently that in Poland, the government offers financial incentives to companies for every disabled employee they hire. Are you in favor of such policies? Do you think that they help, or do they stigmatize? Like, what's your approach on it?
I guess my question is to ask the people who are being impacted by that policy, because in my own learning, once upon a time, I had some very strong views about a disability-only prom. And I remember my friend who volunteered at that event was sharing about it, and I reached out to her and I said, this is really problematic. It's segregating the community. It's kind of leaning into an exploitative inspiration narrative. And she goes, Tiffany, if you talk to any of the students who went to the prom, they had the best time of their lives and they were transformed and they made so many friends. And that was kind of like a call in for me, because while I still don't necessarily agree with the disability only prom, I had to reflect on, why did that Band-Aid event need to exist in the first place? Because they didn't feel welcome in their own school's prom, right? And so now they can show up at a place and have a little bit of intimacy because, again, they don't have to ask for permission or feel like they're weird or that they're different. They're like everybody else there. So it makes me think back to these policies of they're being put in place because underneath all of those is some other issue, right? The thing that you're talking about in Poland, I think some version of it exists here in the US, but the incentive is that we're not even being given an opportunity to have employment in the first place. So I come back to, if that's the starting point, if that's what's going to help get us in the door, then I'm supportive. Unfortunately, here in the US, there is a program like that, but it enables companies to pay disabled people below minimum wage, which is dehumanizing. So
Absolutely.
my hope is that in your policy, we're
Oh,
providing you
no,
an
no, no,
incentive
no,
to
you
hire
can't.
them.
I mean,
So
it's yeah, I think it's you know, and also like two things can be simultaneously true, you know, like on the one hand, I think it can be helpful, and on the other hand, like, is it like, you know, essentialist? Is it, you know, creating, like, perpetuating a particular narrative about disabled people? Probably yes, but it might be helpful at the same time. And sometimes it's important to be able to hold both, like with the prom you mentioned, to hold both ideas in your mind at the same time and figure out what is actually more beneficial in the moment, isn't it?
yes, yes. And the hope is, you know, because I even look at Diversability, and the hope is for that policy to not have to exist. The hope is for me creating a disability-centered community, like that people have communities so entrenched in their local spaces that they don't need to go find a community. The hope is that we have made schools so inclusive that people don't need to go somewhere else to go to prom and feel welcome, right? So this, again, it's like, start where you are. I think I mentioned this quote is like, start where you are, do what you can with what you have. That's where we start. And again, this is the long game.
Yes.
15 years is nothing compared to some of my other friends in this space. And if I've been able to see change in 15 years, like, I can't imagine what the next 15 are going to look like.
Absolutely. And I think people are more open to this change now than they were 15 years ago, which I think. So it's my turn to be a little bit provocative. Do you think that it's possible to reach full inclusivity in capitalist society?
Ooh,
Or extremely
that is
capitalist society like that in America?
Is it possible to reach full inclusion? The idealist in me says yes. I really do believe, like, I think about, like, I do a lot of speaking engagements. There have been instances where someone else gets a speaking engagement, and I remind myself of being in an abundant place, that I'm making space for the next one to come. And I'm so proud of that other person, that they got it, because now their livelihood is supported. I don't know if a lot of people think that way, but I have been trying to figure out, how do we find ways for the disability community to thrive in capitalism? Many of us within the community talk about a post-capitalist era. I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime. So we have to figure out, in what we currently have, how do we create more opportunities? And I guess to your question of, like, can full inclusion truly exist in capitalism? I want to say yes, if we truly believe that resources are abundant. That's my asterisk on it. If resources are scarce.
That's a very clever answer to my to my very provocative question. I wasn't sure if you'd ask me to edit it out later. So I have kept you a bit longer than agreed. I am greedy that way. So I'm not going to ask you about presidential elections. My thoughts are with you guys, because one of the candidates is an antithesis to their efforts here. But for the end, I wanted to plug Tiffany's own wildly popular podcast, Tiffany Yu. It's a podcast about things that matter, where she's having conversations on all things wellness, impact, identity, and leadership. So definitely go and check out Tiffany's podcast to learn more about everything that she does. And
I love it. We actually, the Tiffany and You has been on pause, but we have been moving over some episodes over to Diversability's podcast, which is called Diversability Amplified. But thank you for calling us wildly popular.
I mean, I saw all the accolades attached to it, so let's call it what it is. And definitely check out Tiffany's book, It's really easy to read. It's, you know, it's very well structured. It's, you know, it's for everybody to pick up and read. So
I
thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for coming on the show. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.